I'm David Hinckley, the Director of the Montclair Public Library System. We thank you for coming to the library as always. We ask that you return to use and explore the many exciting new and classy classic services that the library provides as the center of the Montclair community. We are particularly pleased to host today's discussion about confronting the legacy of racism. I am pleased to turn the mic over to John Simon, trustee of the Montclair Public Library Foundation, who will introduce this afternoon's eminent guests.
Good afternoon. The purpose of this series is to provide a platform for authors to come and speak with our community and discuss their latest book. The underpinnings of this forum is to educate, inspire, and expand our collective wisdom, to promote the diversity and excellence of our community, and to spark a passion for reading. At the Montclair Public Library, we strive to provide Montclair and surrounding communities with the tools and resources to stimulate learning. The tireless work that we do to support the academic achievement of our community, and just a few examples, whether it's our summer reading program, team tutoring, or our robust catalog of offerings at the Montclair Adult School. These are the many things that you can take advantage of as a part of our family. As Andrew Carnegie said, a library outranks any other thing that a community can do to benefit its people. It is, and we are, a never-failing spring in the desert. To this end, we operate for the public good, and that is all of you. Events like today's Open Book, Open Minds would not be possible without the unwavering support of our community. While the Montclair tax dollars go a long way to support our operations and our programming here at the library, they must be supplemented with the generosity of our patrons who believe in our mission and the acknowledgement that libraries are the foundation of any great community. With this in mind, I'd like to especially thank Thomas and Susan Dunn for their generous support of our 2016 Open Book, Open Mind series. Please give them a round of applause. We also want to acknowledge those of you who have supported us in the past, especially those who have contributed this year during our recent annual appeal, which I believe is still open, and if you wish to learn more about how you can contribute, Anita Peterson from our foundation staff will be available after the event. Now on to today's Open Book, Open Minds. Today I actually think we've outdone ourselves. For over a year, I unabashedly stalked Dr. Muhammad. At every book event, Library of Association event, our firm actually sponsored a number of events with the Schomburg, and I did not lose that opportunity to pull him to the side each and every time to talk about coming to Montclair to be a part of this series. So, as I've experienced, when you speak to the universe, she will answer, and she will typically answer with generosity and accuracy beyond our wildest expectations. So here we are, overbooked within a matter of days, a packed room, Dr. Muhammad and my friend David Troutt, who's also an author, fellow Montclarian, and legal scholar on equality. The timing of today's forum could not have been better choreographed, as we are at a crucial time in our history where the volume of race and racial injustice is at a fever pitch. As an organization focused on the public good, we felt passionately about opening this dialogue and leveraging Dr. Muhammad's book as the centerpiece. And I want to especially thank him again for not issuing that restraining order. If you don't fully appreciate why I was so persistent about having him here today to talk about the condemnation of blackness, let me give you some context briefly on why you are all so lucky to hear from this well-respected scholar and authority on the topic. First, Dr. Muhammad is a librarian, archivist, historian, and caretaker of the largest repository of historical documents and artifacts that represent and crystallize the rich history of African and African American people in the United States. The Schomburg Center for Black Culture is a treasure that truly represents the depth, diversity, excellence, beauty, and richness of Black history. Dr. Muhammad is known for saying history is the building block of all knowledge in our society. And in his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, he takes us on a historical journey in which he unpacks the way we think, act, and respond to African American criminality. It also looks at the role of early statistics in the 1890 census and how that data began to shape a narrative about African Americans in this country and their perceived inferiority and proclivities to commit crimes. He highlights Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who in 1899, in his writings, The Philadelphia Negro, articulated a thoughtful critique of Black criminality as a consequence of urban inequality and industrialization. Due to foregone conclusions of the academics and scholars at the time, this work was all but ignored because the assumption was made that Black inferiority was effectively a fact and there was no need to further study Black criminalization at the time. Well, in this book, Dr. Muhammad has indeed made Dr. Du Bois proud. He's a native of Chicago, graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and has his PhD from Rutgers, specializing in 20th century and African American history. He became the director of the Schomburg in 2011, and he most recently accepted a tenured teaching position at Harvard University, which he will begin this summer. Moderating for us today is David Troutt. As I said before, David is a fellow Montclarian who serves as professor of law and is the founding director of Rutgers Center on Law in Metropolitan Equity. David teaches and writes in 4 areas of primary interest: metropolitan dimensions on race, class, and legal structure, intellectual policy, torts, and critical legal theory. David has his undergraduate degree from Stanford University and his jurisprudence from Harvard. He's also the author of The Price of Paradise, The Cost of Inequality, and a Vision for a More Equitable America. We hope to have David sit down with us in the future and be a part of the Open Book Mind series, not as the moderator, but as the featured guest. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Montclair Public Library and welcome to Open Book, Open Mind. With further ado, David, let me turn it over to you.
So let's get to it. There's so many ways to begin this. It's a dense and wonderful book. It has all the detailed storytelling of a terrific work of history. And it's critically important, not just to what would appear to be its direct subject matter, but really to the creation of a system, a workable system of racial classification in this country, but also about the social construction of whiteness. And so, so many places to begin, but let me suggest in this intellectual history that a single question sort of dominates the world, and that is, what are the crimes that people commit say about who they are? And what appear to be a simple question would appear to be the kind of question we might put to finding out about an individual who commits a crime that would appear to be out of character. And so we're asking questions about the crime and the character and the matching, our assumptions, etc. But of course, this book is very different. This book is asking that question in a far more complicated sense. It is not a specific crime, it is all crimes. And it is not a specific person, but it is all people belonging to a particular race. And it is all seen through the eyes of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, particularly at the moment, about a generation after Reconstruction. The generation after, where the freedmen are now a full generation out of slavery. And so in some respects, they are a people who have just landed, and they are being sized up by the WASP eye. And the WASP eye is reading them for their crimes. But there is another set of people who are also newly arrived, who also have to be read, and they are European immigrants, not yet white, Irish, Italians, Germans, etc., who come from an agrarian land, who are ignorant, who aren't speaking the language, who don't understand the customs, and who also have to find a place in this country. And they have to be read and they have to be judged, and they too are committing crimes. And so the WASP gaze at the dawn of social science is looking upon both of these groups and making a determination about who they are in the most existential sense, what their character is, what their worth is, against a history of inferiority for African Americans that had always made very clear that they were close to a state of nature. And the question for the European immigrants is whether they are really Americans in progress or something less. And so, as an intellectual history, we meet so many of the social scientists who become our distinguished minds in helping to answer this question. And so let me turn it to you and ask Khalil, why was this so important?
Between Jonathan's wonderful introduction and David's first question, I think you've heard about 2/3 of the book's thesis. Which is great. This doesn't always happen. To really drill down to what David just prompted me with, one of the blurbs on the back of the book says it really brilliantly. It says that whites commit crimes, but only African Americans are criminals. And in that shift from the very notion that we understand crime to be individualized and particular, that is how we experience it as neighbors, as victims, as consumers of the news. And then we extrapolate from that victimization of a person who's had a purse snatched or home burglarized or an assault or, in the worst case, of course, someone who's been killed. And we fit that into sort of mental images of what the perpetrator must have been like and what kind of person would do that. And the problem is that most of us think about that process, that mental process, as benign, as free of history, as particular to our circumstance and moment, particular to our connection or proximity to the victim. Were they like us? Were they white and elite and therefore completely innocent, a random victim? Were they young and black in a bad neighborhood and happened to be the victim of a random bullet flying by? And in those categories, in those mental compartments in our mind, what we don't realize is that we've been set up. Hoodwinked. Bamboozled. No. It is Sunday afternoon. That those mental compartments, those ways of thinking about it, reacting emotionally, those ways of going to our legislators and saying, are the laws strict enough? Do we have enough police officers? Are the prosecutors doing their job? All those responses are attached to this history. That you're building upon layers that were poured 100 years ago. What I like to say is that the infrastructure of ideas, the connections that we make, the causal linkages between what happened and what we're supposed to do about it, are as old as the electricity that Thomas Edison invented just down the road. Roughly the 1880s, same period of time. So, in my casual way of trying to get people to really wrestle with how present this history is with us, to say that as much as we have the possibility for alternative energy sources, we're not there yet. Much of what we're still doing was invented in the late 19th century, not 21st century. And as that way, we are still wrestling with the invention of a set of ideas attached to judging groups of people by their crime statistics. And so the story that David opens up with is essentially that the origin story here, what do crimes say about people, was a question tied to a larger eugenics moment in world history. The invention of demographics as a way of counting people and measuring their birth or mortality, the diseases that they succumb to, were ways of determining essentially whether or not a society was moving in the right direction. And depending on which of those groups were succeeding, that is, excelling in their births, or which were dying prematurely, you could measure the health of the society in positive terms or negative terms. If the right people were dying prematurely or not having enough babies, or exposed to too many contagious diseases like tuberculosis, then you have an all hands-on-deck moment. The society's got to reshuffle its priorities. If the wrong groups were dying prematurely or succumbing to disease, then society, in this day and age, in the late 19th century, might be using its resources more efficiently. Because in the social Darwinist discourse of the late 19th century, this idea that certain groups are not fit to compete, then ultimately you don't want to prop those groups up. That would be, in the words of William Graham Sumner, an inefficient use of societal resources. So the story that I tell is the story when crime enters into that battery of indices, of statistics, of barometers, of ways of measuring people. Because it wasn't always so. And the simplest way of understanding it as a genealogical moment, as an origin story, as a beginning, is that the 4 million people who were enslaved in 1865 were not counted as criminals, by and large. Because they weren't citizens, and therefore subject to the Bill of Rights and the due process procedures that attend to criminality. I mean, what makes American justice an innovation is precisely that one can't simply be taken in the still of the night on the allegation of criminality without proving one's guilt, rather than the other way around. That was an innovation, and David can talk at length about it. That's his field. So the issue of due process, the issue of due process is a citizenship right, which comes with the possibility of being therefore criminalized. So we could think of this as a kind of legal distinction versus a kind of anthropological distinction. So yes, prior to the 1860s, prior to the end of slavery, black people were understood in many circles to be dangerous, to be primitive, to be a threat. But that wasn't communicated. Those ideas were not communicated through what became a much more advanced technology, and that advanced technology was the production of statistical knowledge on a scale that we'd never used before. Sociology as a field of science is born in the 1890s. And so, to come to an early stopping point, so David can get back in here, there was no moment prior to the 1890 census that identified black people's capacity for self-governance and full potential. Those questions had already been debated for many decades, and the jury was mostly that they weren't fully capable. But the reasons for their lack of capacity to fully participate, to be truly human, to be fully citizens, didn't turn on crime statistics. And so in the 1890 census, almost haphazardly, a demographer, and you'll love this, headquartered eventually, by the time he wrote this, he was headquartered in Newark, New Jersey, at Prudential Insurance Company. But he had spent many years in the South. He was a German immigrant, arrived in 1884. By 1892 or so, makes his way to Newark. He's fabulously smart, incredibly entrepreneurial, and has a fetish and a fascination for studying demographic trends. He's one of the first people to identify that suicide was a problem in America, and does an early study in looking at industrial cities across the Northeast, and basically produces some of the first knowledge to say that white people are killing themselves. Why are they killing themselves is a different response, but just to document the fact of self-killing, or self-murder as he described it, was a big deal. And so this guy was no joke, and spent really the next 50 years, from the 1890s to about 1940, being one of the nation's most respected actuaries on issues of health and occupational accidents, etc., through Prudential. He, for many years up through the 1920s, was a single source of producing annual homicide statistics before the federal government began to do so through the Uniform Crime Reports. It just so happens that this is the guy who looks at the 1890 census and says, finally, the smoking gun. I can prove once and for all that black people are not fully capable of self-governance and ought to be watched carefully and have special discriminatory laws set aside to deal with them because they are nearly 3 times overrepresented in the nation's prisons. They were 30% of the nation's prisons in the 1890 census and only 12% of the population. No one else prior to that time had ever turned to this kind of authoritative statistical evidence to make that claim. People had studied brains and body odor. Thomas Jefferson had written about hair texture and many biological features that convinced even him that black people were fundamentally different than whites, and that there was no future of America of equal cohabitation. Lincoln
Wow.
wrestled with these same questions. But those questions were debated. And yet, when it came to the 1890 census, when it came to the notion of crime statistics as resolving a centuries-old debate about what black people were fully capable of, everybody got on board. And so that begins the moment for a broad acceptance that this was a useful measure for determining how much black people should enjoy the full fruits of their humanity in America. Was their crime going up? Was it going down? What crimes did they commit? What crimes didn't they commit? And to throw it back to David, that wasn't the case for European immigrants. It was a pre-existing case. I don't want to keep talking. I want you to refine how you define it, but I can keep going on as you can see.
I was going to say, the gentleman is Hoffman, that Khalil is talking
Frederick
about.
Hoffman. Ludwig. Frederick Ludwig
And
Hoffman.
he's an amazing character in the book. He's sort of the mad scientist, if you will, who, notwithstanding the introduction of all sorts of scientific techniques that would appear to end a lot of arguments, is nonetheless conspicuous in the great contradiction that he and others who follow him continue to repeat. And for me, and so the book is full of all the heroic stories of W.E.B. Du Bois and other black but also liberal progressive era sociologists trying to disprove or trying to at least discredit aspects of the narrative that is successfully being taught by Hoffman to fulfill everybody's expectations about African American inferiority for purposes of citizenship. Remember, this is all sort of a citizenship test, right? But what I find especially interesting then is focusing for a minute on this contradiction. This is sort of a deliberate obfuscation of causality. We see it again and again and again. We probably see it a lot today, even in the way that we think about, for instance, police brutality, right? So on the one hand, you have this scientist who looks at black criminality and sees confirmation of black inferiority and all the stereotypes. So the question concerns then this what I'm suggesting is a deliberate obfuscation of causality. When black people do it, it's caused by inferiority. When European immigrants do it, for instance, high rates of suicide, etc., we immediately look beyond. If it's black people, you look internally at the inferior traits within the black person. If it's happening to Europeans, you externalize and you look at the environment and you ascribe to the environment various causes that are increasing crime, that are increasing enemy, that are increasing public health concerns, etc., and a welfare state is born. Right? So recreational activities and all sorts of important settlement house developments for the socialization and the successful assimilation of European whites. But just the opposite conclusions are being drawn for blacks. Yet it's in the name of social science. How do they, what is the force that permits this obfuscation of causality to continue winning so many hearts?
It's a great question, and I want to read a passage because in some ways you can't make it up. It's really the force of the voice and the articulation of the double standard, or the contradiction, as David puts it, is really powerful. We talked about those mental compartments, and I want to come back to that, sort of where we are today and how we think about it. Well, essentially, whenever something heinous happens that involves a white perpetrator, generally there's a search for answers to the question, how could this be? Because the assumption is that it's an exception to the rule. There must be something to explain why this person would sexually abuse a child, or kill everyone in the neighborhood, or cut people up in body parts, or hold up a liquor store. And there are degrees of engagement around this. But this notion of individuation, this notion that they commit crimes but aren't criminals, is the ideological currency. And the ideological currency says that whites en masse are not criminals, and therefore there may be individuals who break the rule. But the story that Hoffman sets in motion is a story that has to actually begin with the decriminalization of white groups. So In the same way that we both inherit the assumption that something must explain why some white person went and did something terrible, and while most of us don't spend a whole lot of time trying to look past either a kind of generalized poverty explanation for the terrible things that black people do to each other, or a kind of cultural explanation for it. Those are boxes that most of us fall into, and we don't question it. Well, Hoffman had to do two things. First, he had to convince the nation, like in so many others, that there was truly something inside of black people that made them dangerous and a threat, and the crime statistics was evidence of it. And two, he had to essentially make room for the Irish and the Italians to not be subject to the same racialized and criminalizing rhetorics that eugenicists and social Darwinists had attached to them. The xenophobes and nativists of Trump's background of that day. So that's what makes the contradiction so powerful, because it is a moment for roads that might have been traveled differently. There's tremendous indeterminacy in this moment. And that's what I want you to really appreciate by David's question, is because it's not like we're saying there's a through line that says, you know, slavery was predicated on white supremacist notions of black inferiority, and of course those white supremacist notions passed through to freedom. There's part of that, but part of it is this huge disruptive moment that sociology enters into the equation. And sociology essentially is the science of society, and the science of society propagates itself on the notion that we might actually solve some of the most difficult problems that we face in our political economy by looking to what's going on in the society that produces suicide, that produces poverty, that produces misery. And so they cut their teeth, essentially making a bunch of environmental claims that read crime statistics, particularly for Europeans, people of European ancestry, as evidence that society is sick, that there's something wrong in society. It just didn't apply to black people. And that is a question that can't entirely be answered by the genealogical moment without understanding that black people served a purpose in America, which was their labor power. And so their labor power had already established a set of justifications and rationales for why they were here in the first place. So it is both a continuation of the basic understanding that black people couldn't be understood as equal because the whole thing would have created a moral crisis of conscience in the nation. You couldn't establish the first modern republic on the basis that you had enslaved human beings who had the same inalienable rights as other people. They had to be subhuman. Thomas Jefferson had to note that there was something different about them in order to reconcile the contradiction between a nation founded in opposition to enslavement here against the British Crown, and at the same time hold people as property. That never went away. That didn't change. And it is the legacy of that basic contradiction that then propels this notion that we have to see these crime statistics through this lens as evidence of something that, because they still needed black people to go back to work on unequal terms, to be coerced into labor regimes. And so when we sit here as the inheritors 100 years later of this basic set of ideas and the choice that we made to read one group of crime as symptomatic of what's something wrong in society and another group as symptomatic as something wrong with those people, then we partly understand that we are still making choices about how to govern our political economy. And for much of anyone who's read Douglas Blackman's Slavery by Another Name knows that in that work, his understanding of convict leasing, which is another criminal justice innovation in the 1870s, and it lasts through the 1940s, is a way of essentially providing raw labor power to serve our industrial machine, even so much as helping to procure the iron and coal out of Tennessee and Alabama so that it could be refined in Gary, Indiana at U.S. Steel, so that Detroit could become not only the automaker of the nation, but the arsenal of democracy for World War II. You don't build planes and tanks and trains and cars without the steel. And the raw material was extracted from the land by huge populations of coerced black prisoners. So the problem is that we still need somebody to be subject to our larger political economy. I am moving into up-here space. So I'm gonna back off of that. I wanted to share with you a quote from Hoffman which is really a powerful treatment by Hoffman of this issue. So Hoffman, as you've already heard, was one of the first people to talk about suicide as a reflection of something wrong in society. And he uses suicide, so I'll just read. So he says, the study of statistics of suicide, madness, and crime is one of the utmost importance to any society when such abnormal conditions are on the increase. When such an increase has been proved to exist, it is the duty of society to leave nothing undone until the evil has been checked or been brought under control. The health of the people must come before the wealth of the people. We must be far from truly civilized as long as we permit to exist or accept as inevitable conditions which year after year drive an increasing army of unfortunates to madness, crime, or suicide. It is the diseased notion of modern life, almost equal to being a religious conviction, that material advancement and prosperity are the end, the aim, and general purpose of human life. It is the struggle of the masses against the classes. I mean, Bernie Sanders couldn't have said it any better.
Right.
This is a powerful critique of industrialization in its early days. This was written in 1892. I mean, and he is putting his finger on something that will help to make possible the progressive era. The very period that has given birth to a resurgent term, progressive, of which people on the Democratic side of the party are claiming legacy for. Because they're going to be more progressive. They're going to be more anti-Wall Street. They're going to look out for the little guy more than the other. But just note that the notion that you could read crime as a symptom of the strains of modern life is an entirely new thing. And it is an absolute rejection of the eugenic claim, of the William Graham Sumner claim, that the crime statistics were evident of the inferiority of those people, and we might do well to close our borders to them, to sterilize them, to incapacitate or incarcerate them. And so where black people enter into this moment, one generation removed from slavery, is this should have been the moment for understanding exactly the same thing. Here we have these freedmen who have been disadvantaged by the experience of slavery. They are now taking their first steps towards freedom. Du Bois is born in 1868, emblematic of the possibility for what it means to have opportunity. The guy ends up at Harvard, graduates with the first PhD for a black person. He should have been the poster boy for what was possible in one generation, when in fact just the opposite happened.
Right.
The racial omission that makes black folk the negation against which all this progressive talk evolves is functional, it's institutional. I want to get you to talk a little bit about the institutionalization of this racial omission, because there's another tension happening at this time and throughout the period that you're writing about. It is not just the immediate period after Reconstruction, but it is, as we turn the century, it is the incredible increase in lynchings across the South. And it is the beginning in great swell of the great migration of black people from southern towns to northern cities. So they join industrialization. They join all of these ills about which progressives will write and speak so passionately about it. And yet again the omission continues. And in fact, and so there's got to be something functional about that. And I'm wondering, is this the pathology of white supremacy, that it needs this fuel, right? Is this the need for Americanization of new white people, because this is also the birth of a nation? Is this, whatever it is, could you talk about its institutionalization? It's very clear from your research that this feeds Jim Crow segregation and then de facto segregation that we live with even today as much as perhaps any other form.
So when David refers to institutionalization, he already hinted at this earlier, but what is essentially how we think about the relationship of poverty and criminality to working class life the sets of protections that come into being, housing codes, food regulation, the entire infrastructure that essentially represents forms of regulating capitalism are born in this moment. That's the institutionalization. And even down to the granular level of what are the kinds of institutions that will help mitigate the symptoms and causes of poverty. Libraries are one thing. Andrew Carnegie gives tremendous amounts of money to libraries to help democratize knowledge, to give immigrants and poor people an opportunity to be inspired by the same sets of ideas that well-educated people do in the moment when compulsory education was still making its way. That's one expression of this, but there were also settlement houses and community centers and playgrounds. I mean, it's literally an infrastructure that we take for granted today. It didn't exist 100 years ago. The juvenile court system is the first alternative to incarceration, and we hear a lot today in the kind of acronym language of ATIs, for those of you who follow this work or are represented in the field. The juvenile justice system was an institutionalization of a basic idea that children do not deserve to be treated like adults when they have done harm to themselves or to others. And so at every step along the way, and this is where the efficiency question is really powerful. So we could argue that, simply speaking, there was racism and segregation. The instrumentalism of lynching is the instrumentalism of using terror to subvert or dominate a population. That's what terror looks like. Terror looks like, this is what happens to you when you don't do exactly what we want you to do. You do anything other than that, head on a stick. I've been watching Game of Thrones. There's a lot of So that's the instrumentalism. But it has an exact counterpoint in the North. And it's a little bit subtle, but this is what it is. The infrastructure and the institutionalization of a set of social safety nets and reformist possibilities that will stabilize rapacious capitalism, that will tame it a bit, which is what progressives are up to in this moment. It costs a lot of money. It's expensive. And it's not clear who's going to pay for all of this. There's no income tax, no federal income tax in the early days of this. And so all of a sudden, the social scientists and sociologists are saying, we have to do a lot for these people. We have to do a lot for them to keep them from hurting themselves and others, and the ultimate danger of hurting us. The Haymarket bombing happens in 1887. There's a great railroad strike in 1877. There are recurrent depressions in the 1890s. I mean, things are really unstable, and there are a lot of people who are saying, hey, blow the whole thing up. So this need for institutionalizing a reformist infrastructure against the rapaciousness of capitalism costs so much money that partly what happens is we can't do it for everybody. And you actually get a twofer out of it. The twofer comes in the form of, we're going to do it for deserving people, therefore creating the fiction that some people are not capable of benefiting from these reforms. That was a fiction predicated on the notion that we can't do it for everyone. And there's a little bit of slippage. So the Germans get access first, then the Irish, then the Italians. It's not like it all automatically happens immediately.
Right.
So you already see that there's a kind of, there's gatekeeping on who gets in first. But black people serve the function of creating the ultimate symbol of your participation. So the closer you are to black people, both in proximity, residentially, in terms of work, the closer you are to being unqualified or undeserving of this new infrastructure. Hoffman actually makes the point, as do others, and I may read one quick quote from it because it's powerful to hear, that it is inefficient, that it is a waste of time to try to end crime among black people in the same way that you could end crime amongst Irish Americans or Italian Americans.
And he argues this to his boss, too, at Prudential, and then therefore we don't insure him.
Either we don't insure or we charge much higher premiums for them.
Sure.
In a time when there were non-discriminatory laws going on the books in the North about this. So you have essentially an efficiency claim based on our lack of being capable of helping everybody. And so black people become the standard bearers of that undeservingness line, drawing that line. Du Bois talked about this as the psychological wage paid to the working class that at least in their poverty they weren't black people. And that becomes institutionalized. And so you have Frances Keller, who is one of the first female criminologists. She has true liberal bona fides. She's working on behalf of anti-prostitution efforts alongside people like Jane Addams. And she has this really powerful quote where she says that essentially black people are not even equal criminals to whites. She says, you know, what would take a white man who is a burglar to crack a safe a couple of minutes would take a black man 24 hours. That they can't even be equals as criminals. So the line of white supremacy, the line drawing against these two groups is also predicated on what kinds of criminality. There is a moment for the kind of celebration of the intellectualism of crimes. I'm going to stop again here and say, to come back to this, part of what you're seeing in the sufficiency claim, we can't do for everyone, is also the recognition that as 10% or in this case 12% of the population, you can actually jail your way out of black people's claims for full equality. You can't, you know, the white community for both immigrant and native are too big to jail. What you can do is you can close the borders to new populations of them. You don't have to feed the existing population, which actually does happen in 1924 under the Johnson-Reed or Immigration Control Act, which is really the arc of the social Darwinist and nativist movement culminating in a compromise. Like, okay, we maybe have enough of these millions of immigrants who have been arriving on our shores between 1900 and 1914. The Great War has disrupted our trust, so we don't know if we can trust the Germans anymore. We don't know if we can trust the Italians anymore. And so ultimately, the compromise is to close the borders to new infusions of them. But prior to that moment was this basic understanding that if they were turning to suicide and crime, the army of unfortunates that Hoffman spoke to, then we had to help them because we needed them. This notion he talks about of Americans in process is one of the most common refrains. It says, if they're hurting themselves like this, there's something wrong in society, we've got to help them.
So I know that folks want to get in. If this indulge me, I want to ask one more question to try to bring us up to today, and then we'll open it up. So back to this obfuscation of causality. If that is, if you don't mind my use of that phrase to characterize the contradiction in the social science emerging at that time, strictly along racial grounds, doing the work of white supremacy and Americanizing this group of immigrants and creating whole new institutions in this country, justifying segregation. Today, we would appear to see similar kinds of contradictions along stark racial lines when we talk about things like heroin. Right? So heroin addiction suddenly gets the service of social sciences and public health compassion and expertise, but it's overwhelmingly white. Crack addiction gets no such compassion, no such social science. When black folks say violence is a public health issue in our communities, it often falls on deaf ears. When black folks claim Black Lives Matter in the face of innumerable instances of police brutality, one of the first knee-jerk responses is to sympathize with the police officer, characterize the lethality and the criminality of so many blacks, victims or not, and then to try to do a pseudoscientific move on numbers, right? As Rudy Giuliani did, right? Well, why are y'all killing yourselves so much? You know, that's what you really need to be focusing on. So the question is did this become instinctual? Did the work of Hoffman and his like 120 years ago ingrain in the American imagination this notion, this unshakable notion, that black folks really are responsible for their own crime and incorrigible in that. And therefore, they're just deserts that come from that, you know, from a society that has to impose law and order. And that the individuation of white criminals is necessary and borne out by the facts?
Short answer is yes.
Deep question.
But I really like that you're bringing. Well, the question is, how are we to really think about this history in relation to this present script playing out right in front of our eyes about the impact of heroin and methamphetamine ravaging overwhelmingly white populations in states that have significant rural populations. So from New Hampshire to Maine to Iowa and Kansas and so many places. Princeton University professor issued a Hoffman-esque call to awareness. It wasn't exactly a call to action, but it was a call to awareness that middle-class whites between the ages of 45 and 54 are showing higher rates of mortality than working-class black people. It's a new trend. And the trend is taking place, is measured by suicide and premature death, usually related to alcohol or drug addiction. And we've heard our own Governor Chris Christie here express compassion for a friend who lost a child to heroin. I mean, it is mind-boggling to watch it play out. And so that's when I come back to these mental boxes in our heads. Like, we think that, so what we're hearing is like, oh man, we did get the war on drugs wrong. Like the sensationalization of black suffering and treating that black suffering with police battering rams and helicopters and SWAT teams and M15s. Like, man, we got that wrong. Because now white people are experiencing the same overlay or underlay, to be more precise, and of course we're not going to do the same thing to them. But we knew back in the 80s, we already knew that we had created decades of social science to say that you don't treat people, you don't read violence in the community as evidence of the pathologies of those communities. But we chose not to apply that to black people. And it's not clear that today, that even in this reformist moment, that we're willing to go that far. That we're willing, because at the end of the day, part of this, unfortunately, is a sad story in our country. It's a really sad story, but it's also politics. So part of the story that I tell, and I tell the story looking on the ground in Philadelphia, is that, and this is really fascinating, there's a black reformer. He's got a guy who works by day at the post office and by night is organizing. And he's partly organizing on the basis that, like, he wants less crime in the black community. He wants the community to be safer. He wants children to feel safer. He wants there to be less violence, to be less drug dealing. You know, you name it, pick it, A to Z. He's concerned about it. But he also wants to build up the economic capacity of the community by basically creating commitments from the white business class to hire qualified black people. So he's going about this on both ends of the spectrum. The reason I'm telling you this in some detail is because we often hear, so in the language of Rudolph Giuliani, like, you know, he says 93% of all crime or violence is committed by other black people. You know, you should be less concerned about what the police officers do and more concerned about what you're doing to yourselves. So that's the violence card, as I've written about in the New York Times. But he's basically saying that we can only respond to your violence by policing. That's all we can do for you. You've got to do all the work on your own otherwise, which never was true. All those Italians and Irish and Germans were not saved by Italians and Irish and Germans. They were saved by WASPs. They were saved by old Americans who had a lot of money. Some of them were new. Carnegie was new. He made quick money. But the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, and the others, and the Mellons, you know, they were old. And there were many other people who were less wealthy than they were who contributed greatly. So these people didn't even speak English. They had no history of Americanness and were saved. So the story of Philadelphia, the politics of it, looks like this. Here's a black guy doing what a Rudolph Giuliani would say do. Look out for your own people. So he says, okay, I'm going to work by day, and in my free time, I'm going to organize, and I'm going to find resources, and I'm going to deal with the bad guys in the community, and at the same time, I'm going to help the good people. Goes to the mayor of Philadelphia, brings a delegation with him. The mayor takes the meeting, and we don't know exactly what was said, although the press was there and they reported on it. And he also wrote to his sister who lived in Kansas. This is, you know, archival stuff. But I read his letters to his sister, and I know what the newspaper reporter said happened at the meeting. That's it. There's no reporter. There's no, you know, Johnson tapes for this week. And basically, the mayor applauds him for admitting that black people have a crime problem. says nothing about diverting either policing resources to help those who are trying to do what I would call community policing, and says nothing about supporting the jobs program that he was arguing for, which was mostly voluntary support from white business owners to hire black people who they could vouch for and say, you know, this is a good carpenter. Black people had tremendous advanced skills coming out of slavery because they did everything. So it wasn't about people being unlettered or untrained or incapable. This was about opportunity. So he puts all this on the table. The papers say, basically, black people admit they have special crime problems. And then within a matter of months, the mayor initiates Philadelphia's own version of a vice crusade, which spring up all over America. The most famous of this, you know, is the red light district in New Orleans that gets closed in 1917 and sends Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton off to the north, which brings us Kansas, Chicago, and New York's jazz scene. So that red light district is part of this moment of closing down and anti-prostitution and anti-vice. Happens in Philadelphia, and what they do, I mean, you couldn't, so here's the black guy, James Stemmons, trying to do the right thing in his community, trying to take the advice, do for your own community. He needs a little help because, you know, black people don't control the machinery of justice. So he needs help. They shut down white vice, save white families, begin that settlement house movement, invested in that infrastructure. And where do you think all the white pimps, prostitutes, drug dealers, and corrupt cops go? They go into the black community. So by cleaning up the white areas, after having met with members of the black community who are asking for support, black people end up even worse off. Because now the mayor, I mean, the Stemmons, I think it's an exaggeration because this was beginning to happen everywhere, but in his mind, he's like, this guy stole my idea. Like, I wanted all those people to come into the black neighborhood, take away the bad guys, and prop up the good people who were working hard in that community. Not do it in white communities and then send all the criminals. So you can actually track in the crime statistics evidence of arrests falling in the black community. So arrests as a measure of the activity of the police in response to a vice crusade skyrocket, 20% in some instances in some of the, what they call the Tenderloin districts of North Philadelphia. And that's because the police have been sent in there to catch all of the hustlers. So finally, I'll say on this happens in New York and Chicago. Researchers who looked at prohibition on the ground in those cities found almost in every city that the vast majority of vice during the Prohibition era, speakeasies, bootlegging operations, drug dens, you name it, were in black communities in the North, but were owned up to 80 to 90% by white business interests. And guess who caught the bad rap in the crime tables? So the politics of it was that the mayor ultimately sold himself as an anti-crime crusader, cleaning up and saving white communities. That was good for politics. And ultimately, when he had to respond, so that's one example of it. In the Prohibition era, same thing applies, except when the civic reformers and the middle class people get all bent out of shape about, you know, the drug den like a crack house on their corner, they send the police in, but they send the police in and arrest all the black people. They don't arrest the people who are ultimately both providing the capital for the organization and also who are paying off everybody who's invested in these institutions lasting. And so all this is pointed out. Like, none of this is a secret. I can't know it unless people talked about it, but it didn't matter. At the end of the day, it didn't matter. And I think that's what David is getting to. So we have been stuck with the same dilemma, which is that the machinery of justice is in white people's hands. The politics of justice is in white people's hands. I mean, we have still only elected 2 governors since the end of Reconstruction, Deval Patrick and Douglas Wilder. So when you talk about who controls justice, who gets to determine how we prosecute people, what kinds of, no matter what's on the books, prosecution is a limited enterprise. You have to decide which crimes do you actually care about. We are still wrestling with all these mental boxes in people's heads about where the real criminals are and who are the real criminals. And they're not on Wall Street, I can tell you that much.
You know, the problem of specialization of knowledge is very real. It's real in the academy, it's real in the world, it's real across the parties. We have a tendency to think we really know one thing well, and it explains most everything that's worth knowing. And one of the things that I have discovered in my work as both an academic and as an activist is the critical humanistic importance of an interdisciplinary point of view. And that means that I have to be curious and I have to be willing to step into the realm of other experts and learn, even as an adult person. But it's not exactly a childlike curiosity. I do come with my experience, as do we all. And I think what is most informative about our experiences are the principles that guide us. So while we're gathering from all these different perspectives to learn about the important interrelatedness of so many of these issues, you know, we are not new because we still understand some basic principles that have borne themselves out in multiple situations. And so, for instance, it's critically important to really have a strong sense of fairness. And what we do at the Center on Inequality and Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity is to think about equity as a principle that guides the way we bring in information. And if we really interrogate the notion of equity, and if we're really concerned about the damaging effects of inequality, then we're able to sort of strip away, I think, some of our own insecurities, about what we don't know, about some of our absorption with our own ends. And so when you think about how we move towards solutions, we're necessarily thinking in our professional lives and our personal lives about what to do with the box. What to do with the boxes that Dr. Muhammad said that have stayed with us since before slavery began and have reincarnated themselves in institution after institution after institution because they have not been sufficiently interrogated. They have not been sufficiently guided to recognize that we can look at causality this way when we're staring at a white person and this way when we're staring at a black person and continue to do that and have been stuck in this repetition compulsion for generations is something that we can change. So it will ultimately have to work through our institutions, it will have to work through our politics. You know, we'll really have to think very differently about our shared interests. But it begins, I think, with a sense of curiosity about what another expertise shares, with a sense that this is not their turf nor mine, but that we can share this turf, and that these perspectives inform each other and enrich each other. But ultimately that we are true to our principles. And that, it seems to me, is what gets compromised far too often and helps to perpetuate so many of the issues that we're talking about today. So I just wanted to throw that in, and I want to say too, what a tremendous afternoon this has been for me. Listening to such great humanity, the essence of praxis, to see them come together, you know, not just in, but on behalf of all of us in shared space. So I just want to really thank you for coming to Montclair today and sharing in the way that you share.